What we now know as early intervention and the inclusion of children with disabilities in early childhood education has a long history. In the US, we could start with the creation of the first kindergarten in 1856 or policies that came out of the New Deal in the 1930s. But events related to the inclusion of children with disabilities did not truly begin to take shape until the Civil Rights era in 1960. In 1964, the War on Poverty drew legislative attention toward families. U.S. Congress began to recognize that early intervention was a prime moment in development to intervene and break the cycle of poverty. That was when they passed the Economic Opportunity Act. And within the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, there was an 8-week summer program for preschool-age children living in poverty called Head Start. In 1965, just a year later, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was passed. It provided funding for state-operated education programs serving children birth through age 20 with disabilities. In 1968, Congress passed legislation creating Handicapped Children's Early Education Program. Among other things, Congress recognized the need for effective models for serving children with disabilities in programs funded by federal dollars. The government provided funding for 24 experimental programs to promote services that addressed the special problems of children with disabilities, birth through 5 years old. The legislation stated that effective program models would be considered for permanent legislative approval. In 1970, Congress built on the wide array of legislation addressing special education and passed the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act. This consolidated various related programs and legislation related to serving children with disabilities, including the Handicapped Children's Early Education Program. In 1972, the Economic Opportunity Act that was originally passed in 1964 was reauthorized. As part of the reauthorization, legislators' attention was drawn to research that came from the Handicapped Children's Early Education Program, showing the value and importance of including young children with disabilities in general preschool classrooms. The reauthorization of the Economic Opportunity Act mandated that 10% of Head Start's enrollment consist of children with disabilities. This was the first time in history inclusion was recognized on a national level. In 1975, a reauthorization to the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act of 1970 formalized individual education programs, or IEPs, as required documents outlining the services for any child receiving special education services. The reauthorization also mandated all children the right to a free and appropriate public education. It must be delivered in a learning environment with children who do not have disabilities to the maximum extent appropriate. This was referred to as the least restrictive environment, or the LRE. The law was optional for states, but if states requested funding, they needed to follow the law. The mandates only applied to children 6 to 18 years old. However, there were financial incentives for states serving children 3 to 5 years old with disabilities. Minor amendments to the law in the following 10 years focused on funding to support research and the expansion of the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act. In 1986, the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act, which was last reauthorized in 1975, was amended to serve children 3 to 5 and created a voluntary program for children birth to 3. Congressional members recognized that without a doubt, the economic benefit of early intervention were undeniable. And by 1988, every state had opted into the birth to 3 component of the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act. In 1990, the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act was reauthorized again and amended to align with the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. It was renamed at that point in time the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. In 1997, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act was amended to add services for children birth through age 21. In 2004, IDEA was reauthorized for the last time to align with a few pieces of legislation related to general education and incorporate more targeted funding. More than 20 years later, IDEA has received a few minor amendments, but despite calls from advocates, there has been no substantial change. The most significant changes have come through Supreme Court decisions. Most notably were Andrew versus Douglas County, where the justices ruled students must have challenging, ambitious goals, which they can make progress with accommodations and modifications that meet their individual needs. A second court ruling in LHB Hamilton County Department of Education, the court stated that school staff cannot keep a child in a segregated setting or self-contained classroom because they are unwilling or unable to include the child in general education settings. One thing that must be pointed out is that nowhere in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is the word inclusion. However, it has always been a priority. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is a living document. As public opinion changes and education evolves, so too will the law. Thank you for listening to this episode about the history of early intervention, early childhood, special education.